a year from now, are there going to be any Rite Aid stores?
It's definitely not looking like Rite Aid's long for this world. There's give or take about 1,400 stores left after the bankruptcy that initially started back in the fall of 2023. They closed really over 1,000 stores during that period. They managed to work their way through the courts, restructure their debt, but one of the challenges they ran into is that a lot of vendors that they had dealt with previously did not come back. And for most of the last year, if you've been in a Rite Aid store, you could see that their inventories were stressed, that there was a lot of empty shelves. That's an incredibly challenging place to be as a retailer. If you don't have goods to sell, you're certainly not going to make much of a profit. And there's a bunch of reasons for why drugstores have been under stress. But Rite Aid has been kind of the weakest financial player in a three-horse race for the last 25 years. And it certainly looks like they're about to go back into bankruptcy court. In our industry, we'd call it a Chapter 22. It's rare that anybody survives. Joann's, for example, is in the process of closing 802 stores.
City
They
City.
filed yeah, Party City. It's kind of the same old story. You almost never get a chance to survive bankruptcy twice within such a short period of time. There's still some hope that maybe they can sell off their assets, but probably it would be piece by piece. So I'm not hopeful, unfortunately, that Rite Aid is going to be able to manage to survive this.
Went wrong with bankruptcy? Why didn't they manage to successfully reorganize?
Well, I think one of their challenges was just the fact that they really were abandoned by their vendors. Their vendors just didn't want to come back. I mean, everybody in the space has got the same issues, and those issues really come down to this: is that the model for drugstores over the last 30 years was that you had a strong driver of sales from your in-store beauty departments. Well, that's come under greater pressure from Sephora and Ulta, who are both been, really gobbling up that space and creating stores that, away from just, it used to be drugstores where your day-to-day cosmetics, and then you'd go to the mall and department store cosmetic counters. Well, they upended that model. So that kind of took that away from the drugstores. Then front of house, if you look at all those convenience items, you have so much more convenience store competition, food retail. Every dollar store chain over the last 15 years has been boosting their perishables, their convenience items. So they were getting killed on competition on those goods up front. But then back of the house, when it comes to the prescriptions, and keep in mind, a typical suburban drugstore makes about 80% of their revenues from their prescription business. An urban drugstore, which tends to have more consumers that are going in just for their convenience and daily goods items, it's more like 50 to 60%. But that back of the house, that prescription business, well, there's been slower prescription growth across the industry. There's lower generic drug prices. As much as it might feel like we're getting more and more pinched on our medical costs, the reality is
They're making more money at CVS, Walgreens, or Rite Aid.
correct. That really what's going on right now is that there's not as much as specialty medication exposure, which that's like 40% of pharmacy revenues, but it's only about 13% of retail chain revenues. And the big one is reduced margins from insurance networks. Okay. You probably, if you've got insurance, I guarantee you've probably gotten offers from your insurance company. Get these prescriptions sent to you at home and get them 3 months at a time, et cetera. Well, that's basically cutting out the middleman of the drugstore. So all of that's just a real challenge. Lower margins on the pharmacy goods when front of the house, greater competition. You know, I don't think that Walgreens and CVS are on the same trajectory, but both are closing a lot of stores.
It's just they started in a stronger position to begin
Far
with. They
strong.
were they were far bigger. They were like 4 times the size, 3 or 4 times the size, and they didn't have the legacy of problems that Rite Aid had dating back to the corporate scandals.
Yeah, precisely. And so those are kind of the big differentiators. The irony is that even Rite Aid, my sources in commercial real estate, all three of the big chains have been looking at the possibility of smaller format stores in the future that would really just focus on the pharmacy business. And we're talking about, if your typical suburban drugstore is, say, 15 to 20,000 square feet, maybe with a drive-through window for the pharmacy and so forth. We're talking about the old model of like the neighborhood pharmacy that was maybe a 3, 4, 5,000 square foot store, but it was almost 90% just what was behind the drugstore counter. All three of them have been looking at that, which is fairly ironic because that's the model that these guys gobbled up, that they either swallowed up as they grew to get bigger through mergers and acquisition, or that they drove out of business. So it's everything, everything old is new again, I guess. But I think eventually you're going to see some of, Rite Aid. Rite Aid might not be around for this, but I think you'll see CVS and Walgreens eventually starting to dabble in smaller stores that maybe just kind of leave behind that convenience item business, or at least really trim it back, because that's where a lot of the dead space in the drugstores is right now.
It's just the idea you kind of shrink to profitability because right now you've got all that space up front where you're not making money because of everything from Ulta to Walmart to Amazon, all the other places people get this stuff up there. The pharmacy is not maybe a high margin business, but it's still profitable. So you just get rid of the unprofitable space and at least make some money on the part that still makes money.
Right. And remember, a lot of the model over the last 20 years, Rite Aid was kind of excluded from because they weren't growing the last 20 years. But if you think about where's a CVS or a Walgreens that you go to, most of them are really high visibility corners. They're larger stores, they're usually anywhere from 12 to 18,000 square feet. Um, that's expensive real estate. So if they can trim that down, then maybe the costs start to balance out. It's just that the model's really been disrupted. And unfortunately, whenever there's disruption like what's happening when in the pharmacy business, the weakest links are the ones to go first. And Rite Aid has been the weakest link for quite a while.
Well, that's one thing you mentioned, which is the difference in the urban areas, and it makes sense that if you're in a Dwayne Reed in New York City or any of these stores, Walgreens in Chicago, that it might be harder for you to get to one of those other alternatives. So you said that the mix there is still more revenue from the front of the store because maybe I'm
Correct.
willing to pay more because it's just more of a hassle to go somewhere else. Did I understand that correctly? And if so, are
Yeah.
those locations more profitable, even though I realize there's no way to scale that up because there are just only so many city locations?
Well, and that's the interesting thing is because in some cases, these, some of these stores are in food deserts, neighborhoods that don't have a significant grocery presence, or if they do, it's independently owned bodegas that, the irony is in some of our poorest urban neighborhoods, you know, uh, you don't have low cost grocery options, and so drugstores served a real function there, but so much of that's been getting cut into in the last decade, in particular by dollar stores, which never really were very had much of an urban presence until the last 10, 15 years, where dollar stores were highly rural. But as they kept growing, and we had year on year where Family Dollar, Dollar Tree, all these guys were opening 5, 6, 700 stores a year. Well, for them to grow, eventually they had to get down to the cities. So that's kind of cut into where drugstores were in urban neighborhoods. Plus, the last few years, where I would argue that many of the chains that have cited, urban shoplifting complaints in some ways have used that as their excuse on shareholder calls to avoid other deeper problems they had. The reality is that urban locations have much higher security costs. And that's where we've seen not just drugstores, plenty of news headlines would feature, Walgreens, locking up goods in urban locations, or CVS, but even Target with small format urban stores, which for about 5, 10 years they were going great guns on it. Now Target's kind of saying, no, no, we're not going to mess with those 30,000 square foot small Targets anymore. We're just going to go back to what we do best, which is suburban superstores. In fact, they're getting even larger. The old Targets were 110 to 120,000 square feet. The new ones are like 150,000 square feet. So it's it's going to be a real challenge in some urban neighborhoods because no doubt there's going to be some places where drugstores are going to be closing. And I'm not just talking about Rite Aid, which Rite Aid, we could be looking at 1,400 closures alone, but both Walgreens and CVS are trimming back about a quarter of their locations over the next few years. Walgreens is going to close 500 stores this year. CVS is going to close 300 stores. So with Rite Aid, if they end up going belly up, we're talking about 2,500 drugstores going vacant this year alone. And that's on top of at least 1,000 that happened last year. So that's a lot of vacant retail space.
Central Pennsylvania, a little bit of a different situation from other places. Rite Aid, we know nationally is the third player, and it's not even close. CVS and Walgreens, one and two close, and then Rite Aid far behind. But here, Rite Aid has been sort of neck and neck with CVS. It's a rare white space on Walgreens map of their footprint. If Rite Aid goes away, what happens? Because immediately we become sort of one of the only markets with just one of the big players, CVS.
Yeah.
You mentioned Walgreens is closing all those stores. They're not in expansion mode generally, but could they look at some Rite Aids opportunistically here as, hey, that's just too much of an opportunity to let it go away if those spaces become available?
I would be shocked if they don't. They're very savvy. And even, here's the one thing that, especially doing what I do, tracking chain store closures and openings, just because a chain might overall be in contraction mode, the smart ones still look at great real estate and say, wow, okay, maybe our goal is to get rid of 10% of our locations that are unprofitable. That doesn't mean that you give up on brand new spots where you want to be in. Um, you know, so usually what happens when chains are in contraction mode overall is that it doesn't necessarily mean that any new store growth is off the table. It just means that their net unit counts, you know, so we're going to close 100 stores, but we still might open two or three. Walgreens definitely should be looking at some of that real estate, and I think that both CVS and Walgreens are going to look at some of the Rite Aid real estate. The interesting thing is because a lot of the Rite Aids go back to when Rite Aid really was growing, those locations from the 80s and 90s, a lot of them actually line up with smaller format grocery stores, um, just as well, if not better, than what CVS and Walgreens like to do today. So there could be players ranging from Aldi's to Sprouts that might look at some of these locations. The tricky thing is the size. Larger format Rite Aids that go vacant, if they're above 20,000 square feet, um, there's a deeper tenant pool uh, of potential users between 20 and 30,000 square feet right now than there is
It's the size of an
between.
Aldi or even a Trader Joe's or something.
Right. Trader Joe's needs at least 20,000 square feet. They're not necessarily going to look at a 15,000 square foot Rite Aid. But a great location, 22,000 square foot Rite Aid, they might say, hey, awesome, let's do it. So it's tricky because a lot of drugstores, if they're in that 15,000 square foot range, it's a little bit harder to find tenants at that particular number than if you were a little bit larger or a little bit smaller.
Eric Brown of the Brown Book. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Seth.